Welcome. Make sure to watch today's story till the end, because what's about to happen may be beyond your imagination. Let me know in the comments how you felt about the story, and if you're new here, subscribe and stay with the channel. The Ridge Road. The call came at 4:11 in the morning, which was the first wrong thing about it. Emergency broadcast audits don't happen before dawn. They happen on Tuesday afternoons when a network engineer on rotation could drive out, file a compliance report, and be home for dinner. They don't happen in the dark on a Thursday in late October with a voice on the line I didn't recognize asking me to confirm my badge number twice. I confirmed it. I drove. The Ranger started on the second turn of the key, which was generous of it. My father had bought the truck in 2007, the year my mother stopped recognizing him, and he had driven it for 11 more years before the cancer made the manual transmission impossible for his left hand. He left me the truck and 3 boxes of his diabetic supplies and a note that said, "Check the rocker panels. They're going." They had gone. The rust had spread upward into the doors. The rear window was patched with weatherproof tape from a job I'd done 2 summers back. But the engine was honest and the 4-wheel drive worked, and on the Ridge Road in October, that was what mattered. I took Route 7 north out of East Liverpool and turned onto the county road that climbed toward Hawthorne. The headlights cut through a cold rain that wasn't quite freezing. Wet leaf rot on the asphalt. The smell of it came in through the vents, mineral and slightly sweet, the smell of a forest preparing to die for the winter. I had driven this road maybe 200 times. I knew where the deer crossed. The deer weren't crossing. It took me 4 miles to register the absence. I had passed the 3 places where I usually slowed, the bend by the dairy farm, the stretch where the fence line breaks, the long downhill before the Hawthorne turnoff, and I had not slowed once. There had been nothing to slow for. No eye shine in the high beams. No movement at the tree lean. No carcass on the shoulder. In 20 years of driving these roads, I had never made the trip without seeing at least one deer. I told myself it was the rain, the cold front, the hour. I told myself the deer were bedded down somewhere I couldn't see. I told myself a lot of things in those 4 miles, and none of them quieted the small administrative voice in my head that cataloged anomalies for a living. At the bottom of the long downhill, I saw the cruiser. It was parked at an angle on the shoulder, half on the gravel and half in the mud. The front tires turned hard right, as if the driver had begun a turn and stopped mid-thought. The light bar was still cycling. Red, blue, painting the wet trees in colors that didn't belong to a forest. The driver's door stood open. The dome light was on. There was no driver. I slowed. I did not stop. I am a man who verifies timestamps before trusting data. I do not investigate abandoned vehicles in the dark on a road where the deer have stopped crossing. I logged the cruiser's position in my head, mile marker 43, eastern shoulder, and I drove past it at a steady 25 so that whatever might be watching from the trees would have time to see that I was passing through, not stopping. The Hawthorne complex sat on the ridge above the Mahoning River Valley. I came up the last switchback, and the lights of the parking lot resolved through the rain. 3 cars I did not recognize. A silver sedan with state plates. A pickup older than mine, mud to the windows. A black SUV with municipal markings that should have been 40 miles south. The audit had been requested for 1 engineer. I sat in the Ranger with the engine running, my hand on the gear shift, and I watched the building. No movement in the lobby windows. No silhouettes behind the glass. The building looked exactly the way an empty building should look at 4:50 in the morning, which was the second wrong thing. I could turn around. I could call dispatch from the bottom of the ridge. I could be back in my apartment in an hour. I shut off the engine. I pulled the key. I picked up my work bag, and I checked the side pocket for the 3 insulin pens, and I walked toward the door. The lobby, the key card reader chirped green, and the door released, which meant the building still had power on the perimeter circuit. I noted that. I noted everything now. Inside, the lobby was the temperature of a refrigerator and smelled like a place that had been holding its breath. The fluorescents in the drop ceiling were on, but two panels near the elevator bank had failed, and the dark patches above gave the room a checkerboard quality that confused depth. My footsteps were too loud on the polished concrete. I made them quieter without thinking about it, the way you adjust your voice in a hospital corridor. The security desk was on the right, behind a low semicircle of laminate counter. Wendell Mears worked the night shift on Thursdays. He was 64, a retired postal inspector, and he kept a thermos of black coffee and a paperback Western on the desk for the long hours between rounds. The thermos was there. The paperback was there, splayed open and face down, page 87 of a Louis L'Amour I had seen him reading the week before. The chair was pushed back as if he had stood up. Wendell was not there. I walked behind the counter slowly. I did not call his name. The administrative voice in my head reminded me that calling out announced your position, and that announcing your position to an unknown environment was something you did only after you had assessed the environment, not before. I touched the side of the thermos with 2 fingers. It was warm, not hot, not freshly poured. Warm in the way coffee is warm 30 or 40 minutes after the last sip. He had been at this desk inside the last hour. He had stood up, and he had not sat back down, and the building had let him go somewhere without his thermos and without his book. I lifted his desk phone. The line was dead, not silent. Dead, the way a phone is dead when the back-end switching has failed rather than the handset. I set it back on the cradle and turned to the wall panel beside the elevator bank. The panel was the building's electrical status board, a relic from the 1990s that the contractors kept meaning to retire and never had. It showed the power state of every floor and sublevel as a column of small green and amber lights. I read it the way I read sheet music. Lobby green. Floors 1 through 3 green. Sublevels 1 and 3 green. Sublevel 2 amber. The amber meant reduced load, which meant something on that floor had failed and the system was running on a backup. Sublevel 2 was the data center. Sublevel 2 was where the audit was supposed to happen. I walked back to the front entrance and pressed my key card against the inside reader. The door's deadbolt engaged with a heavy mechanical sound that I felt in the floor. Anyone coming in behind me would now need a working key card or a hard breach. I had bought myself a margin. The elevator was stopped on sublevel 2. The indicator above the doors held steady at the number, unmoving. I watched it for 15 seconds. It did not change. An elevator parked on a floor was an elevator someone had ridden down and not ridden back up. I would not be taking the elevator. The stairwell door was at the end of the lobby, past the unmanned reception desk, past a row of framed photographs of the Hawthorne Board of Directors smiling in front of equipment they did not understand. I crossed to it. My right hand went into my jacket pocket and closed around the folding knife my father had carried for 40 years. The handle was bone, worn smooth where his thumb had rested. The blade was 3¼ inches, and I had sharpened it on a Monday in September, the last sharpening it would ever need from me. I did not draw it. I held it in my pocket, and I felt its weight, and I let the weight do what holding a weapon does to the body, which is slow the breath and lengthen the spine. Calm hands. Calm hands were what kept a man alive in a building that had stopped behaving like itself. I opened the stairwell door and started down. Sublevel 2, the stairwell smelled of water before I reached the bottom landing. Not the chlorinated tang of municipal supply. Something flatter, mineral, the smell of water that had been sitting against concrete long enough to take on the building's character. I stopped on the landing and listened. A soft, continuous trickle. The hum of server cooling fans, irregular, some running, some not. No voices. No movement. No breath that wasn't my own. I pushed the door at the bottom open 6 inches and looked through. The data center had a foot of standing water across its floor. The room was a long rectangle, 60 feet by 40, with rows of black server racks rising from raised flooring panels. The raised floor was gone, submerged. The water reached halfway up the bottom server unit in each rack, and the servers themselves were doing something they were never supposed to do. Their status lights were amber. Every single one. The slow, steady amber of a system on emergency battery, draining. I knew where the leak was before I saw it. The chilled water loop ran along the east wall, 12-inch insulated pipe feeding the cooling units that kept the racks from melting themselves. A 6-foot section of that insulation hung in dark rags from the ceiling, and beneath it, the pipe had been opened. Not split, not failed at a joint. Opened. The cut was clean and roughly 3 inches long, the kind of cut a metal saw makes when someone takes their time. Above the cut, on a steel mounting bracket bolted into the concrete, was the manual shutoff valve. The valve handle was turned to the open position. The valve was always closed except during scheduled maintenance. I had personally closed it 11 days ago after the September quarterly. I logged it. I photographed it. The photograph was on my phone in my pocket, time-stamped and verified. Someone had walked down here, opened the valve, sawed through the pipe, and walked back out. I stepped into the water. It was cold enough to numb my ankles inside 2 seconds. I waded toward the central aisle, moving slowly, keeping my weight forward so the displaced water didn't slap against the racks and short anything that hadn't already shorted. The administrative voice in my head was running a damage estimate and a survival estimate at the same time. The damage estimate was catastrophic. The survival estimate told me I had perhaps an hour before the battery backups failed and the room went dark. My workstation was at the far end, the senior engineer's bench, 3 monitors, and a keyboard tray, and a chair I had paid for myself because the building wouldn't. I waded toward it. Halfway down the aisle, something brushed my left thigh. I stopped. I looked down. A laminated security badge floated against the side of the rack, face up. The lanyard had snagged on a cable tray. The photo on the badge was Reza Patel, 32, the junior engineer who had been on call before me this rotation. Reza, who had 2 daughters in Beaver County and a wife who texted him at exactly 9 every night to confirm he was alive. The badge's edges were pristine. It had not been in the water long. I lifted it out and clipped it to my own lanyard beside my own. 2 badges now. I did not know what I would do with the second one. I knew I was not leaving it floating. I reached the workstation. The monitors were dark, but the tower light was the steady amber of battery power. I crouched, water in my waist now, and pulled the keyboard tray out. The keyboard was wet. I dried my hands on the inside of my jacket and powered the system on through the manual switch. It booted. I had perhaps 40 minutes of battery life on this terminal. I would not waste any of it on diagnostics. I already understood. The flood was a weapon. The servers were the target. Whoever had walked down here had wanted these archives gone and had been confident enough in their work to leave before confirming the kill. I pulled up the partition map and began isolating the emergency broadcast archive from the dying systems around it. I had work to do. First signal the partition was responding to my isolation commands when my phone buzzed in my chest pocket. I almost ignored it. The work in front of me had a 35-minute deadline and an unforgiving consequence. But the phone had a particular cadence to its vibration that I had set years ago for one specific category notification, and that cadence was the one I was hearing now. Wireless emergency alert. I pulled the phone out with my left hand, kept my right on the keyboard. The screen was lit up with the Federal Red banner. I had spent 12 years of my career routing into other people's phones. I had built the regional infrastructure that delivered these alerts. I had tested it monthly. I had never, in 12 years, received a live alert that wasn't a scheduled test. Emergency alert. Mass casualty event in progress. Civil disorder reported across multiple counties. Shelter in place immediately. Do not approach affected areas. Do not respond to in-person evacuation requests not confirmed by registered emergency services. This is not a test. I read it 3 times. The 4th read, I stopped at the 2nd sentence. Do not respond to in-person evacuation requests not confirmed by registered emergency services. The wording was wrong. Federal alert templates used standardized language, vetted by lawyers, optimized for clarity at panic-level reading speed. This sentence was specific in a way the templates were not. It was warning against a particular kind of trap. Someone in the alert authority chain knew people were being lured. I set the phone face down on the workstation so the screen wouldn't keep lighting and pulled my attention back to the partition isolation. My hands were cold from the water. My fingers were clumsy on the keys for the first 3 commands, and then they remembered what they were doing. That was when I heard the first siren. It came through the foot of standing water and the concrete walls and the closed stairwell door and the sealed lobby above, and it reached me as a thin, attenuated wail, a frequency more than a sound. Civil defense siren. The county had 3 of them, mounted on steel poles, tested at noon on the first Wednesday of every month, and the nearest one was on the ridge 2 miles east of Hawthorne. I knew its tone the way I knew my own voice on a recording. It was running, not the test cadence, the full alert cycle. A single civil defense siren on a Thursday at 5 in the morning was a sound that had not been heard in eastern Ohio in my lifetime. I waded across the data center to the east wall. There was a narrow horizontal window slit at eye level, 4 inches tall and 24 inches wide, designed for ventilation rather than viewing. It looked out at ground level over the parking lot's edge and beyond it to the county road that descended from the ridge into the valley. I put my face to the slit. The rain had thinned. The eastern sky was beginning the gray that comes before the first real light. The county road was visible in long sections where it switched back down the slope, a pale ribbon against the dark trees. There were figures on it. I counted them. 6 on the upper switchback. 4 more on the section below. 2 on the lowest visible stretch before the road disappeared into the valley fog. They were walking up the road, toward Hawthorne. They were not walking the way people walked. The administrative voice in my head, the one that cataloged anomalies, took over before the rest of me could react. It noted the gate first. The figures were not limping in the way injured people limped, with a favored leg and a corrected stride. They were moving with their full weight on every step regardless of terrain, the way a person walks when proprioception is failing, when the body no longer knows where its feet are. They walked into the gravel shoulder. They walked into the shallow ditch. They corrected. They walked again. 12 figures. Climbing the ridge. I stepped back from the slit before whatever was approaching could see the pale circle of my face against the dark glass. I waded back to the workstation. I did not run. Running displaced water. Water made noise. I had been in this building 31 minutes. I went back to the partition. The locked cage, the isolation completed at 5:14 in the morning. The emergency broadcast partition was now logically detached from the dying systems around it, mirrored onto the secure cage's independent storage, and accessible only from inside that cage. I had bought the archive perhaps another 12 hours of life. I had bought myself less than that. I stood up from the workstation. The water had risen another 2 inches while I worked. It was at my waist now, and the cold had stopped registering as cold and started registering as a slow numbness in the muscle of my thighs. I logged that. I had perhaps an hour of useful function in my legs before the body began rationing blood away from them. The secure cage was at the back of the data center, behind a wall of reinforced mesh, accessed through a single steel door with a biometric reader and a keypad. I waded toward it. Ray's badge floated against my chest with my own, tapping my sternum every other step. The biometric reader was dead. No green standby light. No amber fault. Dead. Whoever had cut the chilled water pipe had also cut the cage's primary access circuit, which meant the cage was supposed to be unreachable, which meant the people who had done this knew exactly what was inside it and had wanted no one to retrieve any of it. The administrative voice reminded me that the cage had a manual override. The cage had a manual override that I was not supposed to know about. 11 years ago, my predecessor in this position had been a woman named Margaret Lyle. Margaret had retired in 2014, 6 months after I started, and on her last Friday, she had taken me to the data center alone and walked me through 3 things she said the documentation would never tell me. 2 of them I had used a dozen times since. The third was the manual override on the secure cage. She had shown me the access panel hidden behind the rack 3 units to the left of the door. She had shown me the recessed lever inside it. She had told me, in the voice of a woman who had seen something she did not want to repeat, if you ever have to use this, do not write it down. Not in a report. Not in your own notes. Not anywhere. The people who built this room expect to know who opens it. I had not written it down. I had carried the knowledge in my head for 11 years. I waded to the 3rd rack from the door. I felt along the rear panel for the access plate. My fingers found the recessed catch. The plate came away in my hand. The lever was inside, dry above the waterline, untouched in 11 years. I pulled it. The cage door released with a heavy mechanical sound that traveled through the water and rang against the far walls. Loud. Too loud. I did not have time to regret the noise. I pushed the door open, stepped through into the cage, and pulled the door closed behind me. The internal seal engaged with a softer sound, a pneumatic exhalation, and the water sloshing against the threshold stopped at the rubber gasket and held. The cage floor was dry. It was raised 6 inches above the data center floor on its own platform. The interior was perhaps 8 feet by 12, lit by a single overhead LED running on a circuit independent of the rest of the building. 2 server racks against the back wall, blinking the steady green of healthy systems. A small workstation, a cot folded against the side wall, a shelving unit holding cases of bottled water. I counted them automatically, 12 cases, roughly 72 gallons, 3 days of survival drinking for one person at hard rationing. A small chemical toilet, a first aid kit, a 2-way radio, a folded wool blanket. It was not a server cage. It was a shelter that happened to contain servers. It had been built for a person to hide inside, while the building above them did whatever it had been designed to do. I stood inside it, dripping onto the dry floor, and I understood that Margaret Lyle had not retired in 2014. She had been moved. The first recording Margaret Lyle had not retired. I held that thought at arm's length for a moment, the way you hold a piece of evidence you're not yet ready to integrate, and I set it down on a shelf in my mind and turned to the workstation. The archive terminal was the kind of machine Margaret would have understood. A beige tower from the early 2010s, the keyboard yellowed at the edges, the monitor a flat panel mounted on an articulated arm. I powered it on. The boot sequence was clean. The system was air-gapped from the building's compromised networks, running on its own dedicated hardware and its own dedicated power. Someone had wanted this terminal to survive things. I logged in with the credentials I had used 100 times during compliance audits. The directory tree opened in a familiar gray window. Regional EAS Archive, District 7, 2009 to present. 15 years of emergency alerts. Every test, every actual broadcast, every malformed signal that had passed through the regional emergency alert system and been logged, hashed, and stored. I had pulled files from this archive 1,000 times for compliance work. I knew its directory structure the way I knew the hallways of my apartment. I searched for today's broadcast. The shelter-in-place alert that had reached my phone less than an hour ago should have been logged into this archive within milliseconds of its transmission. The system was automated. The system did not fail. The search returned a result. I clicked it. The file was a standard EAS broadcast bundle. Header tones, message audio, attention signal, end of message tone. The metadata showed transmission timestamp, origin code, county FIPS identifiers, the duration of the alert, and the hash signature that authenticated it as legitimate federal output. The transmission timestamp was today's date. The recording timestamp was June 4th, 2019. I read both fields 3 times. I right-clicked the file and pulled up its full properties. Created June 4th, 2019 at 11:47 in the morning. Modified June 4th, 2019 at 11:47 in the morning. File hash, stable, unchanged, signed and verified. The audio inside the bundle had been generated nearly 6.5 years ago and stored in this archive ever since. It had been transmitted today. The administrative voice in my head, which had been keeping me alive for 2 hours by refusing to draw conclusions, drew its first one. The alert that had warned the region about a mass casualty event was a recording, not a live broadcast. A pre-recorded file pulled from cold storage and pushed through the live system as if it were happening now. I went back to the search bar. I broadened the query. I asked the archive to return every file whose audio waveform matched the one I had just opened. The search ran for 9 seconds. It returned 12 results. 12 identical bundles. 12 identical waveforms. 12 identical audio files of the same shelter-in-place broadcast. Each one timestamped within a 5-month window between March and August of 2019. Each one stored under a different file name, in a different subdirectory of the archive, hashed and verified, and entirely indistinguishable from the one that had reached my phone tonight. 12 dress rehearsals. I felt the cold of the data center water rising into my chest cavity, a delayed signal from a body that had been holding its alarm for politeness. I pulled the wool blanket off the cot and wrapped it around my shoulders, and I sat down in the workstation chair. The headphones were on the desk where Margaret had left them. Maybe Margaret. Probably Margaret. I put them on. I selected the earliest of the 12 files. March 14th, 2019. I clicked play. The voice was male, calm, professional, the broadcast tone of someone who had been trained to deliver bad news without inflecting it. This is an emergency message from the Eastern Ohio Regional Alert Authority. A mass casualty event is in progress. Civil disorder has been reported across multiple counties. Shelter in place immediately. The voice spoke for 42 seconds. The instructions ended. The end of message tone played. I sat with the headphones on. I listened to the silence after the tone. I rewound the file and listened to it again. The voice was mine. Verification protocols, the voice was mine. I took the headphones off and set them on the desk and stared at the waveform on the monitor for a long count of seconds I did not bother to measure. Then I did what I have done for every anomalous data point I have encountered in 12 years of this work. I refused to believe it. Belief was not a tool a network engineer used. Belief was what people did when they did not have access to verification. I had access to verification. I had an entire air-gapped archive system, a direct, dedicated connection to a sister facility in Akron, and 3 independent timestamp authorities I could query without leaving this chair. The voice on the recording was a piece of evidence. It was not a conclusion. The conclusion would come after I had verified the evidence, and not before. I set my hands on the keyboard. They were steadier than I expected. I started with the file system metadata. I pulled the inode data on the March 14th, 2019 file directly, bypassing the archive's display layer. The inode confirmed the creation timestamp as June 4th, 2019. Wait. The display had said March 14th. I rechecked. The display showed the broadcast date encoded in the file metadata. The inode showed the actual file system creation date. Different fields. Both were 2019. The file had been created on the storage medium in the spring or early summer of that year. There was no inconsistency to exploit. I ran the hash check next. I computed the SHA 256 of the file's audio payload and compared it against the hash logged in the archive's signing ledger. Match. I checked the signing ledger's own integrity hash against the Federal Verification Authority's published value for that quarter. Match. The chain of trust was intact going back 6.5 years. If the file had been forged, it had been forged before June of 2019, and someone had successfully inserted it into the federal hash chain at the time of creation. That was not a hoax. That was an operation. I queried the Akron facility next. The sister facility's archive was a physical mirror. A separate building, a separate power grid, a separate set of LTO tape backups updated weekly and rotated to a vault that was, on paper, accessible only to 2 people I had never met. If someone had wanted to fake an audio file's age, they would have had to fake it here and in Akron simultaneously, and the Akron tapes had been written to once and never rewritten. They were physical objects. They could not be modified remotely. I sent the query. The connection held. Akron's tape index returned in 11 seconds. The file was on the Akron tapes. The tape labeled Q2-2019. The tape that had been written to in July of 2019 and sealed in a vault in August. The tape that, according to the chain of custody log, had not been removed from its vault in the 6 years since. I sat back in the chair. The administrative voice in my head, which had been running verification protocols on autopilot, had nothing left to verify. It surrendered the floor to the next voice, the one I trusted less, the one that had been waiting through every check. I told myself the things I was supposed to tell myself. This could be a sophisticated hoax. This could be a planted file with a backstory engineered for plausibility. This could be a red team exercise, a federal test of the regional system, a training scenario someone forgot to dismantle. There were 6 explanations available to me before I had to accept the 7th. I clicked back to the archives directory tree. I had been so focused on the broadcast file that I had not yet looked at what else was in the directory beside it. I scrolled. There was a second folder. It was filed in the same parent directory as the 12 dress rehearsals, with the same access permissions, hashed by the same authority. The folder's icon was the standard archive icon. The folder's name was 3 words. Vance_TECHU_archive. My name, filed beside the recordings of my own voice in a system that had been built 6 years ago. I did not open the folder. Not yet. The folder with his name, I did not open the folder. I stood up instead. I walked the 8 feet to the back wall of the cage and laid both palms flat against the cold steel mesh and looked through it at the dark data center beyond. The water out there had risen another inch. The amber lights of the dying servers reflected off its surface in a slow constellation of failure. I made my breathing match the rhythm Margaret had taught me on a Tuesday in 2014 when a $10,000 storage array had crashed during a federal compliance window. And she had said, Theo, the panic is data, but it is not useful data, and we have other data to look at. I walked back to the chair. I sat down. I opened the folder. The folder contained 17 audio files. They were arranged chronologically, oldest to most recent, the file names following a pattern I recognized as a federal classification format I had encountered exactly once during a continuity of government briefing I had attended as a junior engineer in 2016. The format was used for what the briefer had called standby civil messaging. I had not understood the term at the time. I had assumed it meant routine civil defense. I clicked the earliest file, November 8th, 2019. I opened the metadata first, before I let myself hear the audio. The file's stated content was a regional evacuation instruction broadcast for Steubenville and surrounding municipalities. Duration 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I had never broadcast anything for Steubenville in my life. I had never recorded an evacuation instruction in any voice, for any city, for any reason. I put the headphones back on. I clicked play. The voice came through clean and close, the way voices do when they have been recorded in a studio booth with proper foam panels and a good condenser microphone. And the voice was the voice I had used 20 minutes ago to whisper calm, hands to myself, in the stairwell. It was younger, lighter, less worn at the lower register. But it was the same voice in the way that my hands at 15 had been the same hands as my hands at 41. I knew it the way you know your own breathing. The voice read evacuation routes for Steubenville. It instructed civilians to leave their homes within 90 minutes of the broadcast, carrying only essential medication and identification, proceeding northwest along Route 22 to a staging area at the Carroll County Fairgrounds. The voice was patient. The voice paused at appropriate intervals to allow listeners to write down what they were hearing. The voice ended with a sentence I would never have written, in cadence that I would never have used. And yet the sentence came out of my own mouth on the recording with the conviction of someone who had been paid to mean it. Stay calm. Help is coming. We are with you. I closed the file. I opened the next one. February 2020. Quarantine procedures for the Mahoning Valley. My voice again, for months older, reading an instruction manual for sealing a household against airborne contamination. The voice told listeners which rooms to occupy and which to abandon. The voice told them how to ration drinking water for a family of 4 across a 14-day isolation window. The voice told them what to do with their dead. I closed it. I opened the next. I went through 11 of the 17 before I stopped. Each one was a different scenario. Civil unrest containment, power grid failure response, pandemic shelter protocol, industrial contamination evacuation, mass casualty triage instructions. Each one was my voice. Each one was from a year I could account for, a year I had been alive and working in this building and audited monthly and verified to be doing the work the building had hired me to do. The 17th file was dated June of last year. I clicked it. The voice on the recording was older now, closer to the voice I had used this morning to confirm my badge number on the phone. It read with the file's metadata, called Final Farewell, Cleveland. I had never been to Cleveland. The voice said goodbye to a city of 500,000 people. The voice said it the way you say goodbye to a person you have loved for a long time and are now releasing. I took the headphones off. I sat in the chair. I did not move for a long time. The diabetic math, I did not move for a long time, and then I moved because my body told me to. The cold of the data center water had finally registered in my pancreas, which was the part of my body that no longer worked, which meant the cold registered as a chemical rather than a sensation. My blood sugar had been climbing for 90 minutes. The stress of the last 3 hours had pushed cortisol into a system that could not modulate it. I needed to eat. I needed a dose. I needed to do both within the next 20 minutes, or my hands would start shaking, and shaking hands were not a luxury I could afford in this room. I pulled the work bag onto my lap. I unzipped the side pocket. 3 insulin pens. I lined them up on the desk beside the keyboard. I checked each one in turn, the way I had been checking insulin pens for 31 years, which was a habit my mother had taught me before she stopped recognizing my face. Pen 1, 300 units. Full. Pen 2, 300 units. Full. Pen 3, 190 units. 2/3 full. The one I've been carrying in my jacket pocket all week. Total, 790 units of long-acting insulin. And my standard daily dose of 42 units, divided between morning and evening. That was 18.8 days of medication. That was the optimistic number. The honest number was different. The honest number assumed that stress, illness, infection, and physical exertion would all push my insulin requirement upward, sometimes by 50% or more. The honest number assumed that I would dose more conservatively to stretch the supply, which meant my blood sugar would run higher, which meant I would lose mental clarity in the back third of the supply window. The honest number was 9 days of reliable function. Maybe 12 if I was very lucky, and the world above this cage gave me time to rest, which I had no reason to assume it would. 9 days. I had a backup supply in a medicine cabinet of my apartment, 15 miles south. I had a 30-day stockpile in a cooler in my sister's house in Pittsburgh, 90 miles east. I had standing prescriptions on file at the CVS in Lisbon, 6 miles down the ridge. The CVS in Lisbon. I closed my eyes and did the geography in my head. Lisbon was a town of 2,000 people sitting in the valley below Hawthorne. The figures I had counted on the switchback were walking up from that direction. They had come from somewhere, and the somewhere was almost certainly Lisbon, which meant the pharmacy was already inside the contamination radius. Probably had been since before midnight. Probably looted, probably dark, probably staffed by people who were no longer staff in any sense the word could carry. I would not be picking up a prescription in Lisbon. The administrative voice in my head ran the equation a second time, looking for the error. There was no error. The equation gave me 9 days and a 6-mile pharmacy I could not reach. I preempted my own paranoia, the way I had been trained to. I said the words out loud to the empty cage, because saying them out loud was how a person in crisis kept the part of his mind that planned from being overrun by the part of his mind that feared. I have 9 days of insulin. I have to leave this building before that runs out. I cannot leave yet because I do not understand what I am inside of. I have to understand it before I run out of time, and I cannot let understanding it take longer than it has to. I said the deadline next. 48 hours. Maximum. The cage took the words and gave them back as a flat acoustic that the foam panels on the walls absorbed cleanly. No echo. The sound did not travel out of the cage. Margaret had thought about that too. I dosed the pen. I ate a granola bar from the work bag. I sat with my hands flat on the desk and waited for the food to register, and while I waited, I went back to the archive. The listener, the food registered in my bloodstream at the same moment the terminal made a sound it should not have been able to make. A soft electronic chime. 3 notes descending. The default notification tone for an inbound connection request on a system I had isolated from every external network in the building 40 minutes ago. I looked at the monitor. A small dialog box had opened in the lower right corner of the screen. Incoming connection request. Authentication. Pending. Source. External. Accept/decline. The connection request had a source IP address. It had a routing domain. It had everything an ordinary network handshake had. The only thing it was not supposed to have was a path into this terminal, because this terminal had no path out. The administrative voice in my head, which had spent the last 4 hours building a case for the impossibility of various things, accepted that the case was now closed. The case had been closed when Margaret Lyle did not retire. I had simply not finished reading the verdict. I did not click decline. Decline would tell the requester that something was alive on the other end, and choosing to refuse them. I clicked the small X at the corner of the dialogue. The dialogue disappeared. The connection request would time out on its own and register on the requester's end, as the system being unresponsive rather than active. Then I opened a terminal window and started doing what I should have done before any of this began. I traced the inbound path. The connection had reached the cage's network interface through a routing chain that should not have existed. I followed it backward, hop by hop, building a map of the path on a notepad beside the keyboard. The first 3 hops were inside the Hawthorne building. That was already wrong. The cage was supposed to be air-gapped. Someone had run physical fiber from the cage to the building's external trunk, which meant the air gap had been a fiction for as long as the cage had been occupied. Margaret's cage. Margaret's fiction. The 4th hop took the trace out of the building entirely onto a regional fiber line I recognized as a federal backhaul circuit. The 5th hop pushed it onto a domain I did not recognize. I queried the domain registry. The domain was registered to a subsidiary called Ridgepoint Communication Solutions, LLC. I knew the parent company. Every network engineer in the federal adjacent space knew the parent company. They had built half of the regional alert infrastructure in the eastern United States across the 1990s and 2000s. They had been dissolved in a corporate reorganization in 2017. The parent had absorbed 3 of its operating subsidiaries and shed the rest. Ridgepoint had been one to shed once. A defunct subsidiary, dissolved 7 years ago, was actively requesting access to an archive containing 17 recordings of my voice. I had perhaps 5 seconds to register that thought before the terminal chimed again. A second incoming connection request. Different source IP. Same routing domain. I closed it the same way. The 3rd one came 19 seconds later. Then a 4th. Then a 5th. They were stacking. They were not waiting for an answer. They were probing. I understood, with the small, clean clarity that arrives in the middle of a crisis when the rest of the noise drops away, that the terminal had been quiet for 6 hours and was now flooded because something I had done in the last 5 minutes had triggered a watcher. I had opened the folder with my name. I had played the 17 files. I had queried Akron. Somewhere in that sequence, I had broken a silence that had been holding since this cage was built, and the people on the other end of that silence had noticed. They knew someone was reading. They did not yet know it was me. The probes were trying to confirm it. Each one was asking the same question in a slightly different way. Who are you? What are you? Are you authorized? I killed the network interface entirely. I yanked the fiber from the back of the terminal with my own hand and watched the connection lights go dark. The chime stopped. The cage was silent. But somewhere out there on a server farm registered to a company that had not legally existed since 2017, someone now knew the archive was awake. The roof camera of the cage was silent, but silence in this building had stopped meaning safety 3 hours ago. I stared at the dark fiber port for a count of 10. The administrative voice in my head, which had been outpacing the rest of me for most of the morning, told me what I already knew. Pulling the fiber had bought me anonymity, not invisibility. The watchers on the other end now knew that something inside this archive had been alive for the duration of the probes and had then gone dark in a way that suggested deliberate action. A storage system that crashed went dark differently than one that was unplugged. They would know the difference. They would now be doing whatever they did when they had confirmed a reader. I did not have the luxury of guessing what that was. I had to see what was outside. The cage's secondary network stack handled the building's internal camera system on a separate physical interface from the archive trunk. I had not pulled that one. The cameras ran on a closed loop that had no path to the outside world, only to the building's own monitoring station. I opened the camera client and selected the rooftop array. The Hawthorne complex had 11 exterior cameras, arranged in overlapping fields of view to eliminate blind spots in the parking lot, the loading dock, the perimeter fence, and the access road. I pulled up the parking lot view first. The screen filled with the gray pre-dawn light of the lot. The rain reduced to a fine drift. The 3 vehicles I had logged on arrival still in their positions. There were figures around them. I counted slowly, the way I counted servers during inventory, touching each one with my eyes before moving on. The administrative voice did the work without my permission. 5 at the silver sedan. 4 near the muddy pickup. 3 at the black SUV. 2 more standing flat against the lobby's outer wall, motionless, facing the building. 14 figures. I switched to the second camera, the one that covered the gravel turnaround at the lot's northern edge. 1 more figure stood there, hands at its sides, head tilted at the angle a person tilted their head when they were listening to a sound the rest of the world could not hear. 15. I went back to the parking lot view and watched them for 30 seconds, because 30 seconds was the amount of time the administrative voice told me I could spend learning before I had to act on what I learned. They moved in the arrhythmic gait I had seen on the switchback. The 4 at the muddy pickup were drifting in a loose orbit around the vehicle, bumping into its bed, correcting, drifting again. The 5 at the sedan were closer together, almost stacked, as if some shared signal had drawn them to that one car and was holding them there. The 2 against the lobby wall were the wrong ones. They were not drifting. They were waiting. I leaned closer to the monitor. The 2 against the wall were wearing Navy work uniforms. Coveralls. The cut and color of the regional electrical utility, the one that handled the Hawthorne substation contracts, the one I had personally coordinated with on a service call in August. The patches on their breast pockets were too small to read in the camera's resolution, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Hard hats clipped at their belts. Tool belts still around their waists. The reflective striping on their cuffs catching the lot's security lights. Utility workers. The utility workers had not been in the parking lot when I arrived at 4:50. There had been 3 vehicles. There were still 3 vehicles. No utility truck. The 2 figures in coveralls had not driven here. They had walked here in uniform from somewhere else, and they had arrived after I had locked the lobby. They had been alive and working on the morning of the outbreak. The federal alert had reached my phone at 5:14. The figures in the lot were wearing uniforms that meant they had been on shift when whatever had happened in Lisbon had happened, and they had become what they now were in the time it had taken me to wade across the data center floor. The infection was faster than the broadcasts had admitted. It was minutes, not hours. The voice from the tape minutes, not hours. I let the number sit in the room for a moment because the number changed every calculation I had made since I walked into the lobby. Then I did what the administrative voice told me to do, which was return to the archive and find a file I had not yet looked at. I had played 11 of the 17 recordings before I stopped. There were 6 I had not played. 6 scenarios I had not yet heard my own voice deliver. I scrolled to the directory listing and read the file dates. 5 of the 6 were dated to past years. Drills, rehearsals, already executed or already forgotten. The 6th was dated tomorrow. I sat with the cursor hovering over it. The file's metadata gave me its scenario name. Civilian Assembly. Hawthorne Staging, Phase 1. I clicked it. The waveform opened in the audio player. 5 minutes and 22 seconds. The hash signature was clean. The creation date in the file's node was July 19th, 2019, at 2:14 in the afternoon. 6.5 years ago, in a recording booth I had never seen, my voice had been captured reading a script that was scheduled to broadcast at some point on a Friday in October of 2026. That Friday was tomorrow. I put the headphones on. I clicked play. The voice came through with the same clean studio quality as the others, the same calm professional cadence, the same patient pauses for listeners writing down instructions. I closed my eyes so that I could hear it without the visual context of the cage. Listening to a voice that was your own and was not your own was easier with your eyes closed. The brain stopped trying to reconcile. This is an emergency message from the Eastern Ohio Regional Alert Authority. If you're hearing this broadcast, you are within the affected zone. A controlled evacuation is now in progress. Civilians within 20 miles of the Hawthorne Communications Complex on Ridge Road are instructed to proceed to the complex on foot or by personal vehicle for transport to a federal staging area. Bring identification, essential medication, and 1 bag per person. Transport vehicles will arrive at hourly intervals beginning at sunrise. The voice gave directions to Hawthorne. Specific directions. From every county road within 20 miles, from every state route, from every interstate exit. The voice named the side roads and shortcuts. The voice acknowledged that some routes would be impassable and gave alternates. The voice was so thorough that it could only have been written by someone who had stood in the parking lot of the Hawthorne complex and looked at every approach and thought carefully about how to channel human beings toward this single point. The voice ended with the same sentence the Steubenville recording had ended with. Stay calm. Help is coming. We are with you. I took the headphones off. The administrative voice in my head did not need to explain what I had just heard. The explanation arranged itself before I asked for it. The recording would broadcast tomorrow morning. It would reach every phone, every radio, every television, every emergency alert receiver in a 20-mile radius. People still alive in their homes, in basements, in the back rooms of stores, in the bathrooms of strangers' houses, would hear my voice telling them that help was here and that they should walk to the ridge. They would walk. They would arrive at the parking lot I had been watching on the monitor. The 15 figures in the lot would not be 15 by the time the broadcast went live. The two utility workers had become what they were inside of an hour. By tomorrow morning, the lot would be 100. I knew it would be more. The recording was a calling tone for a feeding ground, and the parking lot was the trap. And the parking lot had been chosen 6.5 years ago, and the directions had been written 6.5 years ago, and the voice giving the directions had been recorded 6.5 years ago in a studio I had never entered by a person who was indistinguishable from me in every way except the part where he had agreed to read it. Someone had been farming survivors with my voice. For 6 years. The manual transmitter 6 years. I left the number where it was and stood up. The cage was not large enough to pace in, but I needed my body to move while my mind worked. So I walked the 8 feet to the back wall and turned and walked back twice, 3 times, my wet pant legs slapping against the dry floor. The administrative voice in my head, which had been keeping pace with the catastrophe all morning, was now ahead of me. It had already done the math on tomorrow's broadcast. It had already counted the listeners. It had already laid out the geography of the kill zone the recording would create, the radius of the call, the demographics of the people most likely to obey an official voice in a crisis. It had already decided what I had to do. It was waiting for me to catch up. I caught up. I sat down at the workstation. I opened a directory I had not opened since 2019, when I had been certified on it as part of my senior engineer qualification. The certification had felt absurd at the time. Why would a regional broadcasting authority maintain an analog manual override on a fully automated digital alert system? The answer the certifying officer had given me was the kind of answer government people gave when they did not want to elaborate. Redundancy. I had not pressed. The directory contained the operating manual and the access protocol for the Hawthorne Building's manual emergency transmitter. The transmitter was a physical analog system separate from the digital broadcast architecture, located in a small cinder block equipment room on the 4th floor. It was a Cold War relic. It used a hand microphone and a vacuum tube power amplifier and a transmission protocol that predated my career by 20 years. It connected directly to the regional broadcast antenna mounted on the building's roof. It bypassed every digital signing process, every federal verification authority, every modern routing infrastructure. If I went to that room, plugged in a microphone, and read into it, my voice would broadcast on the regional emergency frequency in real time. Every emergency alert receiver in the eastern Ohio coverage area would pick it up. Every car radio with the alert function enabled. Every television tuned to local broadcast. Every weather radio. Every smartphone subscribed to the federal alert system. I could warn them. I could tell them not to come to Hawthorne. I could tell them the recording they would hear in the morning was a lie. I could give them my real voice in the real moment, saying the real thing, and the difference between the real voice and the recorded one would be audible to anyone listening carefully because the recorded one was 6 years younger and the real one had spent the last 4 hours in cold water. The cost was not abstract. The transmitter was not in the cage. It was on the 4th floor. To reach it, I would have to leave this room, climb 4 flights of stairwell with 15 figures in the parking lot and an unknown number inside the building, plug a microphone, and broadcast for as long as the message needed to be broadcast. The broadcast would be loud. The vacuum tube amplifier had no stealth setting. It hummed when it ran. The room would be audible from the corridor, and the broadcast itself would be a beacon. The watchers on the other end of the dead fiber line would hear me the moment I keyed the microphone. They would know I was inside Hawthorne. They would know I was alive. They would know I had heard the recordings and understood what I had heard. They would know exactly which building to send whatever they sent next. I stood with my hand on the back of the chair, and I let the administrative voice run the calculation it had already finished. Warning thousands versus surviving myself. The math was not balanced. The math had never been balanced. The math had been settled the moment I heard my own voice telling people to walk to a parking lot full of the changed. I checked my insulin. I checked the knife in my pocket. I closed the archive folder and pulled up the building's floor plan. I prepared a broadcast. The countervoice the transmitter room was on the 4th floor, and it took me 11 minutes to reach it. I will not narrate that climb in full. I will say that I went up the stairwell without using my flashlight, that the building was warmer on the upper floors than the data center had been, that I passed the 3rd floor landing and heard, behind a fire door I did not open, the slow sound of something dragging itself across carpet in a pattern that was not panic and was not pursuit and was not anything I had a word for. I did not stop. I climbed. I reached the 4th floor, and the corridor was empty, and the cinder block equipment room was where the floor plan said it would be. The door was unlocked. Margaret again, probably. Margaret had been thinking about this room for a long time. I went in. I sealed the door behind me. The transmitter was older than I was. It filled half the room, a wall-mounted bank of beige metal panels with analog meters and toggle switches and a single-hand microphone on a coiled cord. The vacuum tubes glowed faintly in the standby state, drawing trickle current from a dedicated battery system that had been maintained, against all logic, for 40 years. I did the pre-flight in the order the certification manual had taught me. Power up, carrier check, frequency lock, antenna confirmation. Each step took longer than it should have because my hand was shaking from the cold and the cortisol and the climb. The carrier light went green. I lifted the microphone. I keyed the transmit button. The vacuum tube hum filled the room, low and steady, the sound of a piece of equipment that had been waiting 40 years to be useful. I held the microphone 6 inches from my mouth, the way the certification manual had instructed, and I read the warning I had written in my head on the way up the stairs. This is a real-time emergency broadcast from Theo Vance, Senior Network Engineer, Hawthorne Communications Complex. Do not approach Hawthorne. The recording you will hear tomorrow morning instructing you to come to this location is a fabrication. The parking lot is occupied. Repeat. Do not approach Hawthorne. Shelter in place. Trust no broadcast that gives you a destination. Trust no voice that tells you help is coming. I am alive. The recordings are not. I keyed the transmitter off. I keyed it back on. I read the warning again. I read it slower this time, with the pauses Margaret had taught me to leave so listeners could write things down. I was halfway through the 3rd reading when my own voice cut in over mine. It came through the room's monitor speaker, the small audio feedback that let an operator hear what was actually being broadcast on the frequency. My real voice in the room, hoarse and tired and 41. And on top of it, smoother and younger and broadcast clean, my voice from 2019. Disregard the previous transmission. The previous transmission was made under duress by an unauthorized operator. Civilians within 20 miles of the Hawthorne Communications Complex are instructed to proceed to the complex on foot or by personal vehicle for transport to a federal staging area. Transport vehicles will arrive at hourly intervals beginning at sunrise. I stopped reading. I keyed off. I listened. The 2019 voice continued without me. It read the full assembly script. It read the directions. It read the closing sentence. Stay calm. Help is coming. We are with you, with the same patient cadence I had heard 4 hours ago in the cage. It finished the recording. It started over from the top. I stood with the microphone in my hand, and I understood. The recordings had never just been recordings. The recordings were a parallel system, a second broadcast architecture, sitting on the same frequency I was using, capable of overriding any signal that contradicted its scripts. Whoever had built it to win arguments in real time. They had anticipated that someone, eventually, might find the archive and try to warn the region. They had built the override before they had built the lure. I could not stop it from inside the cage. I could not stop it from inside this room. I could not stop it from inside this building. The 2019 voice kept broadcasting. Calm, professional, patient. It was running against me. The plan to climb it was running against me, and I could not outrun it from inside. I stood in the transmitter room for a long count of breaths and let that fact settle into the part of me that planned. Then I keyed the microphone one final time, not to broadcast, but to do what the certification manual had not taught me. I unscrewed the head of the microphone. I separated the diaphragm from the housing. I cut the wire that connected the diaphragm to the transmission line with my father's knife. I screwed the housing back together. The microphone now looked exactly as it had when I entered the room. It would no longer transmit. Anyone who came up here to use it after me would key it and read into it and broadcast nothing. It was a small act. It was the only act available to me in this room. I left. I went back down the stairwell. I did not pass the dragging sound on the third floor. Something had moved. I did not investigate where. The cage felt smaller when I returned to it. The way a room you have left and re-entered always feels smaller. I shut the door behind me. The pneumatic seal exhaled. I sat down at the workstation and opened the building's structural blueprints, and I gave myself the permission the administrative voice had been asking for since the broadcast had been overridden. I gave myself permission to leave. The blueprints loaded. I pulled up the elevation view first, then the ventilation schematic, then the topographic map of the ridge that the architect had used to site the foundation. I read them the way Margaret had taught me to read a system in failure mode, looking not for the obvious exits, but for the paths the system had not been designed to defend. The parking lot was a kill zone. The lobby, by extension, was a kill zone. Anything I did at the front of the building would put me into the field of vision of 15 figures who were waiting against the walls. The loading dock at the rear was no better. The cameras showed 3 more figures drifting through it. Every door at ground level was compromised. The roof was not. The ventilation shaft above the cage ran 28 vertical feet through the building's mechanical core and terminated in a louvered exhaust housing on the roof. The housing was bolted from the inside. It was designed to be opened by a maintenance technician in case of fire, which meant it could be opened by me if I climbed the shaft. The blueprints showed the maintenance ladder bolted to the shaft's east wall. I had used it once in 2018 during a humidity calibration. I knew it was passable. From the roof, I could descend the ridge's eastern face on foot. The east face was the side the architect had not built into. It was steeper than the road approach, cut by drainage channels and old logging cuts, dense with second-growth oak and shadbush. It was difficult terrain. It was also terrain that the figures in the parking lot would not be able to follow into in any organized way, because the change did not navigate around obstacles. They walked into them. The east face dropped down to a logging road that ran north and south along the base of the ridge. My Ranger was in the parking lot, which I was abandoning. But the logging road intersected the county road 3/4 of a mile north of the Hawthorne turnoff, and the county road was where I had passed the abandoned cruiser at 4:30 this morning. The cruiser had been left running. The cruiser had its keys in it. I had a vehicle. It was not the one I had arrived in. I packed. I took the smallest hardened drive from the cage's emergency supplies, wiped it, and copied every file from the 17 recording folder and the 12 dress rehearsals onto it. The drive went into a waterproof pouch. The pouch went into the waistband of my pants against my back. I took 2 pins of insulin. I took the wool blanket. I took the radio. I took the knife. I waited for midnight. I climbed.